Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thanks for joining us for today's event, Mobilizing McKay. This event is held as part of Parking Day. Parking Day is an annual global event where people repurpose curbside parking spaces and convert them into public parks and social spaces to advocate for safer, greener, more equitable streets for people. But we would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Chichage, Montreal. And we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities examining research questions and projects, things happening across the university. Enough from us, it's now my pleasure to hand the microphone over to the Coordinator of Student Engagement from the Office of Student Life and Engagement, Alex Oster. Alex, it's great to have you.
Thanks, Douglas. I'll just introduce a little bit. I'll allow you to introduce yourself, but I'll just maybe catch you up on kind of where we're at in our programming today. We're street side along Mackay, and we're going to be welcoming a series of guests. We just had Mia, the sustainability coordinator for the student union, who's obviously leading the charge and carrying the flag for student mobilizing on campus and around sustainability. So Donny, I'd love if you maybe wanted to introduce your role on campus and kind of how you first came to be involved in organizing around Rue Mackay.
Okay, so my name is Donny Seto. I'm the recent hire for an LTA position in GIS for geography. I have been with the department for almost 20 years, teaching part-time as well. But before that, I was also a student here with the department. What's interesting is I got involved pretty early because I used to be the president for UPA, the Student Association for Urban Planning. And one of the things that we were vested in was greening Mackay. So it's kind of nice to see it kind of come back to life and this conversation take place again. And hopefully, there's always been incremental changes, which is really nice about the space. And to kind of see it go on to the next step would be great.
Right on. I'm going to maybe underline a few things you said. Yep. So GIS?
Yes, so Geographic Information Systems. So it's basically a software that allows you to kind of play around with data, whether it's tabular, and make it spatial. So one of the data sets that we have been working with in some of my classes for impact assessment was to look at pedestrian flows, but also car flow and truck flow throughout the neighborhood, but highlighting some of the incidents that have happened in terms of serious accidents or accidents that have caused mortality. One of the sad things that have happened in and around campus in 2014 was there was a pedestrian death on the corner of St. Catherine Street and Mackay with a heavy truck. So it's just to highlight that even though we don't necessarily think about this street as a very high accident, high traffic street, there are actually huge pedestrian flows, and there are kind of spaces that there are kind of, incidents happening. So looking at that, it kind of highlights some of the needs in terms of like re-looking at what are the priorities that we want to kind of push forward. Specifically knowing how many students get on the street out of all the different Concordia buildings that then lead to each other. Yes, there is the tunnel, but most of the students pick the street, right? So,
and especially if it's on a beautiful sunny fall day like we have today.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pull apart some of the things you said there. I think it was really great. Obviously not great that we had a pedestrian death so recently. In preparing for today's event, today was actually instigated by our community partners, the Table de Quartier, Peter-McGill. They had approached us to say, Parking Day is coming up, formerly known as No Car Day, and we wanted to do something on the street. We were looking to connect more with youth, with student groups. What can we do? And so in talking to all of the people along Mackay who work here, who study here, it's amazing how much research has been done, actually. how many people have invested time and energy in thinking about safety, how people perceive the street, how they feel on the street, urban agriculture on the street, seating, traffic flows, parking, construction. There are so many ways that people plug into the street and think about it, but it's not really consolidated anywhere. So I guess for the people walking by or maybe people listening in, I guess from your perspective, having looked at these impact assessments, traffic flows, pedestrian flows, I guess what are your impressions about how people feel about the street? Where do people feel safe or unsafe? And I guess like where are the pain points? What are the things that are concerning to you, again, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I can speak from this from different hats, if you want to call it that. From a cyclist that probably uses that section of the street every day.
Just make sure the mic's
sorry. So from a cyclist point of view that probably uses the street every single day, it is a spot for congestion. So like as a cyclist, you have to be hyper aware. And on most of the other street corners, I'm not so aware. But specifically on these ones, whether it be here or on Guy, you have to be hyper aware of like all the activities that are going on. So I think from that standpoint, but also as a pedestrian, you do the same thing. And I think it's kind of this idea of like, I think we do risky behaviors when the risk is high, but also when the risk is low. So, if we think that there's nothing happening, like we will kind of walk across on a red light, or when we think that you're put at risk and it's a risky corner, then we would kind of like try to scuttle when we have the opportunity, right? So, but it causes for other knock-on effects of like problematic behaviors for other people as well. Cars kind of feeling that situation that they're put in as well. So this idea of conviviality is something that we talk a lot about in urban planning. How do we kind of improve conviviality for all transport modes? So whether it be from a pedestrian point of view, from a cyclist point of view, from a student perspective in terms of like how they use but also engage in the space. So having that opportunity to kind of think about, but also maybe dream about what are the spaces that are useful to you on a daily basis, right? Or what that you have to engage in on a daily basis. So I just saw the map show up that I've prepared. This was prepared for an impact assessment class that I produced that I had students work on. And you can kind of see like the little hotspots, the red areas are areas that have had serious injuries or a lot of road deaths between 2012 and 2017. And I don't think that the situation has changed much since then. Probably very similar. But you can see that Concordia is one of the areas, and Guy and Mackay being highlighted as one of those areas. So like being able to kind of think about, well, that is true, so how do we kind of react to that, right? And knowing that there are kind of these situations, how do we kind of reflect on maybe making that area safer, whether it be neck downs as the city has already done, restructuring the street in terms of Guy intersection, along with Maisonneuve to make it a little more pedestrian friendly. But it also still is a very confusing intersection. You always see people kind of look around going, where am I supposed to go now? So given that is still the behavior, what else kind of could be or should be done is kind of the question.
Nice.
Right? So.
I mean, we had spoken about you coming here and you described this map, but it wasn't until I saw it that I really thought about the connection to some of the harm reduction work that student groups are doing around specifically sexual violence.
Yeah.
And here we had the Concordia Sexual Assault Resource Center out here talking, and I know a lot of the student associations have just finished up their orientation and frosh programming for incoming students, and they take that really serious approach to harm reduction. They're saying, if you look at who our membership is as student members, they are a high-risk population for sexual violence. So what do? We change our approach. We address the pain points, and we bring in training. We change vocabulary. We think about safety at events, things like that. So yeah, it's really, as much as we can prepare for this, it's not until I see it that I'm able to actually connect it to so much of the good work that students are doing around preventing sexual violence.
So some of the things that maybe kind of are relevant to think about at the scale of the street network sometimes is, and also this keeping in line with this harm reduction, but maybe from a network perspective, is that this is one of the links on Mackay that connects to the highway, and it links up. It links up like a lot of Sherbrooke Street in terms of Côte Neige to the highway. So there's a lot of streets that are kind of using it as a shortcut. When the other streets are kind of heavy trafficked, they will kind of then select the street as an alternative.
Right.
But like, should it be an alternative is kind of a question, right?
And I guess, how does the city, or how would an urban planner distinguish between, let's say, local traffic? So the Hive Cafe and Reggie's are two student-run organizations that face onto Mackay. They take delivery of kegs, they take delivery of bulk coffee and creamer. So they'll need, alongside our other commerces that, make up the community. I guess, how can we balance that, or like what would be the ways to distinguish between, yes, we need access to our buildings for residences, for commerces, for people, but we want to avoid people speeding through just to get down the hill?
Yeah, well, an easy way would be to take that connection away to the highway. Maybe change the direction of Mackay on certain streets. So like on the lower section of Mackay, you could have it go the other way. And then that will eliminate that potential linkage. Another way to think about it would be to kind of think about it as kind of like a hierarchy. What do we actually want to prioritize first? And then if deliveries do happen, that does happen, but like don't necessarily make it that they're given priority over everything else, right? So think about who should be given priority, and then think about how do we then kind of give access to those that need access, but maybe not give them like total carte blanche in terms of what they do. So where should they park? How should they engage in the space? We think about this in terms of what we call home streets, or place streets. So give the access to those that need it first, and then organize it so that other access can happen but isn't prioritized. So that would be probably how I would think about it in terms of like making sure that those that need access do get access, but know that they're kind of guests in the space instead of like have absolute rights to the space.
Oh, nice. I mean, already themes are emerging from these series of conversations, because Mia was here talking about how can we put student associations at the center, right? And so it is, you're saying, like, these are choices we can make about how we use public space, both, as an institution, Concordia, but also the institutions of the City of Montreal who own the space, and also other layers of government who have an effect. I'm curious, I guess, again, drawing on your perspective as an urbanist and as a professor, for somebody who maybe walks down the street and doesn't see it in the same way as you, what are some of the hard things to change, or what are some of the constraints or limitations that we wouldn't necessarily think about how to, what restricts the use of the space or changing it?
Yeah. So one of the things is that you actually have to engage all the stakeholders that are on the street, and then think about, well, what are some of the things that we idealize, or what are the things that we kind of think about that are priorities? But maybe instead of taking that approach, having those tough talks with the stakeholders to kind of understand what are their needs, and then how to embed all those needs into the space, first and foremost. And then after the fact, then think about what are other, how do we kind of make the things that are oftentimes at opposite ends do work together. So parking is something that's really kind of central to the conversation, because I think all the previous attempts to pedestrianizing the street have been stopped by people's right to, or want to, or needs of parking, right? Or access to the street in terms of car movement. So if we can kind of think about those and then say, well, how it can, if it's not addressed in the space, how can it be addressed near the space, right? So if those things are addressed, then kind of how do we then move on, right? But it is a difficult conversation to have. But I think that they have to understand what is the pros of taking away those parking spaces, and what is the positive benefit to them, even though they don't necessarily see it in the short term? What it is the possibilities in the long term. So if there's more pedestrian traffic, what does that equate to? Yeah. If it becomes a friendly space that has families come back to the neighborhood or actually be able to use the space on off hours when the university is not working, what does that offer to the community at large? So what are the things that we want to see in our public space that we often don't talk about because we normally put it at the last rung to be addressed at the end, right? When there's space remaining or when there's funds to do that. But I think all of us have wish lists, that things that we would like to see happen in the space around our neighborhoods or around our communities. How do we make sure that those things are actually in the spaces that we are living in or working in or kind of frequenting? So I think all of us have to dream a little bit in terms of figuring out what are the things that we want to see on a daily basis in the spaces that we frequent, and then kind of advocate for those things that we want to see happen. I think if that happens, it'll make it a lot easier to kind of understand the dream, but then understand what the deliverables are after the fact.
Well, you know I'm going to have to ask you now about your wish list. So I guess what would be your wish or dream or idea for kind of Mackay specifically, but you can also expand
I think
on that.
Just this kind of shift towards pedestrianizing, but also making public space more accessible and putting it first in terms of our priority list, because I think it oftentimes falls through the cracks and it's addressed at the end. And when you address at the end, it's only so much that an architect or a designer can do with what we call seminal space when there's, or limited space. So if we kind of think about it first, then we can kind of address it and make it a priority, but also make it real, right? And oftentimes the city wants to do it, but for numerous reasons, it only comes together at the end, and at the end it's too late, right? So how do we put that in the forefront if that's the thing that we want? So I would say, put your advocate hats on and fight for the things that you believe in and that you really want.
Okay, and again, I'm so grateful to have you here, and I've been lucky enough to know you, get to know you over several years. I guess as a professor and teacher and lecturer, how would you advise a student who's interested in these topics or seeing any of these amazing leaders and organizers out here today? How would you encourage them to get involved in this?
I think information is power, but also being able to actually get involved in things that are kind of seen as mundane, whether it be your city council meetings, events that are held in place that you frequent. All of those things kind of link up, right? So whether it be community organizations that you frequent or that you use, maybe then put in some time to those resources, because if they don't exist, then you don't have access to them, right? So, and the same for the city. If you're not actively involved in the city, then your voice doesn't get heard, right? So, I think those are the easiest way to kind of start the advocacy for the things that you want, is attending to those events where the meetings and where the decisions are made, right? So if you're present and you're in full force, those decisions are hard to make that are counter your needs or your wants, right?
No.
So,
nice.
yeah.
And I guess obviously we were speaking specifically about Mackay, but are there other areas of concern in terms of specifically pedestrian or cycling safety that keep you up at night or are really worrying from the data?
In terms of the data, the city has done, to be honest, the city has done a lot of work on this. Specifically, the truck traffics is an issue. The city is trying to reduce the size of the vehicles, switch to other modes of truck traffic in terms of whether it be cargo bikes delivering parcels to what they call mail centers that then take away the heavy trucks from the city center. Nice. And also limiting access to those trucks on local streets. But it doesn't, just because you limit access doesn't mean that trucks don't go on them.
Yeah.
It's just this kind of idea of, well, you're not really allowed here, but when traffic gets bad, behaviors change, right? So as I said before, when the risk is high, people behave badly.
Yeah. Huh.
So, but the thing is, like, how do we kind of think about these kind of sequential changes to get to the place where we want to be? So don't think about little, like, have to have these gigantic changes right off the bat, but think about these micro changes that will get you there.
Right. Well, speaking of changes over time, I guess for those that weren't around Mackay when you first started to come here as a student and has continued here, I guess, like, what are the big differences that you've noticed or changes that you've missed or appreciated?
So as a cyclist, I do appreciate the station to fix your bikes as well. I've used it many times, specifically for emergency reasons, but sometimes just to tweak something that's a little annoying. Also, the addition of the Claire Morissette bike path is great. It was a hard fight, and there's it's incremental changes again, because when the first time that was installed, turning the left turns on the bike paths were horrible, right? Every intersection was a little bit like you were grinding your teeth, making sure that it was clear before you headed out. But with the light changes, it's quite nice, right? You have your priority. You can go on those green lights and not have to worry about trucks turning into you. One of my first accidents was exactly that, avoiding a truck that was turning left without checking in their blind spots. Other things, just this idea of pedestrian and public space on Mackay and all around Concordia. So even on Bishop Street, there's this kind of a lot more public benches. They've tried to reduce speeds on Bishop. Hasn't really worked, but it is nice that the university is trying, right? So there's a lot of public spaces there. And the campus feel is just ever growing year on year, so that is nice as well.
Oh, nice. In preparing for today's session, there was interesting Concordia Journal articles and pictures and archives around how the annexes looked or how they were decorated. I think it was much more colorful, but apparently that was one of the first backlashes that was received from the community, was that Concordia, in an attempt to make the space more inviting, put some quite garish colors on the handrails and doors of all our annexes, and that was not well received.
No.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the hall building, which we love and is emblematic of Concordia, was actually one of the buildings that replaced a lot of those annexes, right? Yes. So, and started that conversation before Heritage Montreal decided, let's put a halt to this and really reflect on whether we want to do this or not, right? And that reflection is actually what took away what would have been a sister building of the hall building right behind it. So all of the annexes that are behind the hall building would have been another kind of hall-esque building with an atrium in between. So the terrace that was there was supposed to be an atrium between those two buildings.
Does that explain why the facade extends onto the terrace as well?
Yeah, okay. So that was the intention, right? So to kind of create an enclosed space. But now the university is reflecting on the terrace, and we've done work on reflecting what should the terrace be and what it could be, right? So well, later on today we're going to be speaking with some of the architects from facilities planning. I think they'll be able to shed some light on that, but I do know, for example, I spoke to Jackie Martin, the biodiversity and urban agriculture coordinator here, and the planting plan was done in such a way as to mimic all of the flora from Quebec. So moving from the very shady end and having tundra and the northern Quebec species all the way down to the western end, which gets a lot more sun, and it being more southern Quebec. So there's definitely lots of thought going into some of the public space, and from people like yourself and other guests. So I'm happy to give the opportunity to others to meet you and hear from the tape. I guess, do you have closing thoughts or, again, things that you'd like to put out there for either passersby or somebody that's coming into this conversation? Yeah, I think Mackay is one of those streets where there's a lot of potential, and we just have to kind of dream it and then try to make those changes appear. So dream big and engage. That's what I would kind of pass on as my last message.
Right on.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donny.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Just hang tight real quick. So our next guests are in about 5 minutes. So I did want to also just give you the chance, like, because we're not live streaming, if there was anything we didn't get to. I think I covered most of the stuff that we had talked about. I love that we name dropped Claude Morissette for the East-West Bike Path. I think there's a whole other series of conversations around like cycling and mobility and the advocacy that has been done over decades to get us to where we are now.
Yeah.
And then it's unfortunate to hear some public statements from people around like the desire to reduce or audit, some of the infrastructure that's been built up. So it's, I think there needs to be more support for that idea of like cycling infrastructure. We're here today for Parking Day because we're talking about public space that's fairer, greener, and safer, right? And cycling infrastructure helps with that.
I guess I can share my thoughts on that. I think what people confuse infrastructure with is the reduction of other infrastructures. And like, just because we're expanding one infrastructure doesn't mean that we're necessarily taking away capacity or capability from other infrastructures. So just because we're expanding cycling lanes doesn't necessarily mean that it's always the car loses. Sometimes it makes the car areas more efficient, because you can imagine if we had all the people riding on, let's say, the Claire-Morissette bike path, Saint Denis bike path, Park bike path, in cars,
alone,
what that would look like in terms of car traffic, right? And we might experience that next week with the SDM strike,
true.
Right? But every time that there is a strike in terms of whether it be a transport agency to a disruption on transport, or a closing of a bike path, you can kind of see the response in terms of what happens afterwards. So just because we're expanding cycling infrastructure, or there was a push to expand cycling infrastructure, part of that is also about climate change and how do we kind of reduce our climate footprint, right? And getting people into bikes for short trips and leaving their cars at home has multiple benefits, whether you get healthier population, whether you take away a spot or a car from the downtown core that could have been driving around for 15 minutes trying to find a parking spot, to that parking spot itself, right? It's all about the space and sharing that space. So if we think about going back to this idea of conviviality, what does that mean, right? Also, we have to think about, I think, regardless of the mode that you choose, you are a pedestrian at the end. So the last mile, the last kilometer, the last 500 meters, you will eventually have to walk or engage in the streetscape some way, shape, or form. So, so there are benefits to you too, right?
Yeah.
If you are a car-centric person. Yeah. And, sometimes you don't have a choice to use a car because of the way that the city's laid out. But if you had a bike path and it was a 15-minute trip to your place of work or your place of interest or your activity, would you not want to try it out and see how comfortable or not uncomfortable it is? And if it's uncomfortable, what are the things that make you uncomfortable about it? And then have a conversation like, how would I then feel comfortable cycling to the place that I want to get to, right? And I think it's also demystifying the myth that cycling is unsafe, right? There are certain aspects when you're putting in certain situations that, yes, it could be unsafe, but most people choose safe behavior, right? So why do people feel unsafe? Is it because of the level of traffic that's on the street? Is it the idea of how vulnerable you are, or like the risk of tipping over on a bike? It's a multitude of things, but I think most people have to try to kind of figure out what is it really that's stopping you from cycling, right? And seeing cycling as an extra modal choice like how to get from point A to point B. Like having options is nice. Not having to rely on your car is good, right? Like, do you want to be spending 60 minutes in a car to get to your destination? If you didn't have to, would you? Right? If it was a 15-minute train ride or metro ride instead of a 60-minute grueling, nail-biting car trip, why not, right?
Yeah.
So, but having those options is nice.
Yeah. No, I love the way you frame that, and you're a man after my own heart, Donny. Anytime we can approach a subject that's not zero-sum, right? That building up cycling infrastructure, pedestrian safety doesn't take away from others.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to identify as a driver or a cyclist or a pedestrian, and then other everybody. But as you say, like we're all going to be pedestrians, and it makes me think of a mantra that comes out a lot at the Access Center for Students with Disabilities here is that we're all temporarily able-bodied. Like you come in and you're not able-bodied, and then you have kind of, some of us, have this able-bodied for a period of time, and then towards the end you need mobility help, you need assistance. So if we build infrastructure that supports the margins, it supports everybody. So I love that approach to say, no, this isn't zero-sum. We're not taking away something to build something else. We're building something that's going to support a way that we live together, right? Convive, conviviality. So that's great. Pop quiz maybe on yay or nay on specific tactics for, so speed bumps to reduce speed?
Speed bumps, they're a short-term solution because they only last for a certain amount of time, right? People feel the bump and then all of a sudden slow down, but then they will speed up automatically afterwards. So speed bumps, they're nice to kind of say something is happening or something is up ahead, but oftentimes the speed bump isn't placed in the right spot because most people speed up afterwards, and right after the speed bump is what we want to avoid, right? But if you put it too close, then the speed bump has no utility because by the time they realize there's a speed bump, then they're up in the air and dangerous, right? So it's, I think the speed bumps are an easy solution, but that long-term doesn't work, right?
Okay.
So I think more activities on the space, whether it's narrowing the street or creating different ways to kind of make things more visible. Oftentimes it's as simple as cutting a hedge because the hedge is blocking what is seen beyond, right? So making sure that the visibility is there so that they know where they're going and what's beyond and what needs to be protected. Because I think all drivers as well as pedestrian acknowledge that there is a vulnerable population that needs to be protected. But when they don't kind of see or aren't able to engage and see it too late, that's when problems happen, right? So, other quizzes?
No, I think that was because you had mentioned slowing down traffic on Bishop, and I was like, okay, what about this as a tactic?
So there are multiple ways. There's in the Mile End, there's a lot of different ways that they've tried. There's the chicanes, which causes you to have to kind of do zip lining through streets. In the Plateau is great because you have very narrow streets with parking on both sides, so that cars automatically are aware and thinking that there's somebody that's going to open the door or somebody that's going to walk out. There are, you can change the materials on the street. What else? It's especially important to think about how, when you have multiple modes engaging in a space, how those things should work or could work, right? And also not think about perfect behavior, because we always think, how should this work perfectly in the perfect context? But we have to think about actually if people act badly, what will happen in the space? So you have to think about worst case scenarios and think about, well, if people are acting badly, what are the recourses?
Yeah.
And then how do we prevent people from acting badly, right? Or at least make it easy to not act badly, right? So people are aware that this is tons of pedestrians crossing, sometimes not perfectly, sometimes on red lights. How do we kind of inform that this is a pedestrian space first, so that they feel engaged in the space and say, okay, I'm a guest here, so that I can kind of engage in the space as a guest, right? Yeah, so it's also that, right? Just kind of figuring out people don't act perfectly and how to kind of deal with that.
No, on that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time, Donny. Loved having you here, and yeah,
Thank you for inviting
we'll
me
talk to
as
you
well.
again soon. Yeah.